All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Habal Leinu Latova, Ushi and Mindy Schreiber, in the Schus for Refuah for Ilio Rafael Ben Miriam, Matin Chanalea Margalit, in memory of Mati's father, Yosef Shlomo Moshe Shmuel Ben Yukosu Yehuda, whose yahrzeit is on Chav Dalet Teves. Daf Yomi today, sponsored by David and Elizabeth Green, in memory of David Green's grandmother, Bertha Katzip, Zichron Levracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those who need a refuah shaven together with Kol Cholei Yisrael, Halvai, we should be Zochem Eretz Hashem to continue Besoros Tovos Aklal Yisrael. Special welcome back to our Chavrus Reb Sammy Esterson, who is back after getting up from Shiva for his father, Zichron Levracha. We, of course, dedicate our learning in the schools of Mordechai Ben Yornei Meretz Hashem. We should have a licht Gan Eden, should be a Melis Yosha for his mishpacha, that Rebbe Shalom should blanket the entire family with nechama and strength in the time ahead. Both said with that, let us begin. Today's daf is daf Kuf 100. We are picking up really great daf today. We are picking up on Sadik Tesma Beis 99b, where the Gemara says, Rav Asi Amar Lo Kasha Kansha Meis Lo Meis. So it is pretty much right point in the middle of the page. In fact, the easiest way to find it is if you see Tosas, which is on the right-hand column, Tosas Onein, and you move your finger to the left in the Gemara, and then you move your finger 4 lines up, you will see it right there. It's pretty exact. Right? So remember again, just to reorient ourselves a bit, the Gemara was dealing with the interesting case. The Mishnah said that halacha l'maisa, an onain cannot receive a portion in a carbon to eat it that evening. Now, remember again, the logic behind that was as follows. In yesterday's daf, we created a rule. Well, we didn't create anything. The Gemara created a rule. And the rule was that essentially, if you can eat, it's really a two-pronged rule. If you can serve, then you get a portion. And if you get a portion, you can eat, which by extension means that if you can't serve, right? If you can't serve, you don't get a portion. If you don't get a portion, you can't eat. And when we say you can't eat, it means you can't even eat that night. So for example, an onain who can't serve, right? Remember again, the only onain who could serve in the Beis HaMikdash is only onain, Kohen Gadol, but aside from him, no one else is allowed to serve. So therefore, an onain who can't serve can't get a portion. Because he can't get a portion, he can't eat. So the Gemara made an interesting inference. The Gemara said, yeah, what we can infer from this is, it's true. He can't get a portion, but that night, if his friends want him to join them, ultimately, again, he could join them. The problem the Gemara said is that halacha l'maisa, we quoted a brisa, and the brisa said, at most, maybe that works for Karban Pesach, but it will not work for other kadshims. The Gemara said, Ravasi said, Lo kasha, kan shemes lames ba'arbasar, v'kavru ba'arbasar, kan shemes lames b'shlosha asar, v'kavru ba'arbasar. So this is very interesting. Ravasi said there's 2 different cases over here. And remember, we're going to speak more about this today, but the Gemara says like this, it's really 2 cases. One is where, let's say, Ruvain, we'll call him Ruvain, right? So Ruvain's father, Yaakov, died. So what's the case? One is where Ruvain's father died on the 14th, and they buried him on the 14th. So interestingly enough, remember, Aninos, and we're going to talk about this more explicitly, Aninos is the day of death. Now, Midrabanan, what we're going to see is that Chazal extended Aninos into the night following the loss. But that is Drabanan. So Ravasi wants to make the following distinction. When do we say that an onin can't eat karbanos even at night? That's when death and burial occurred ultimately again on that day, on the 14th. Ultimately again, and therefore Aninos still extends into the night. In that case, he can eat Karban Pesach, but he can't eat other karbanos. Remember again, Karban Pesach is going to be different because failure to eat Karban Pesach is a kares-bearing infraction. As opposed to, listen to this, let's say Yaakov, the father, died on the 13th. So if he died on the 13th, then what does that mean? The Aninos day is really when? On the 13th, right? And now burial is taking place on the 14th. Here's what Gemara is suggesting. Everyone agrees, at most, Aninos of the day of death extends into the following night. Aninos of the day of burial does not extend into the following night. So therefore, again, if Yaakov died on the 13th, right, and he wasn't buried to the 14th, in that case, Reuven would be free and clear for Karbanos for Karban Pesach and other Karbanos already on the night of Pesach itself. The Gemara spells it out. The Gemara says, Yom Kvura lo tafes leilo midrabanan. Ultimately, because the day of burial does not go ahead and include the following night for Anina's purposes. So both say. So let me just highlight to you what's just happened over here, because this is very important, and we're going to expound on this then in the Gemara ahead. Remember, midaraisa, and also understand we use the word onein very differently contemporarily than the way the Gemara is understanding it. When the Gemara sees that aninos, not very differently, a little bit differently. Aninos means day of death. Right, so Yaakov is the father. Yaakov dies on a Tuesday, so Reuven is an onain that day. And now also the halacha is operating under the assumption that generally death and burial will occur on the same day, which then means, right now b'drabanan we say that the following night, so that's what we'd call Wednesday night, right, the night following Tuesday, ultimately there's also aninos, but that aninos is drabanan. Then I said, what the Gemara is suggesting is like this. If Yaakov dies on Tuesday, right, and he's buried on Wednesday, the only time that Chazal extended aninos into the night following the day of death, ultimately again, or I should say, the only time that aninos is extended into the night is when it's the night on the night following the day of death. But if burial was delayed until the next day, everyone would agree that aninos does not extend into the following evening. That's the model that the Gemara is espousing right now. So the Gemara says, okay, man tana aninos laila midrabanan. Bless you. Who is saying that aninos that extends into the night following the day of death is drabanan? To which the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon disanya aninos laila midivrei Torah de Rabbi Yehuda. Yehuda holds that midaraisa aninos is, and by the way, say, from where do we know that aninos is a daraisa to begin with? We haven't covered that. That I mean, will probably end up being Tuesday's daf, Wednesday's daf, tomorrow's daf. So the Gemara says as follows: where do we know that aninos, the nighttime aninos, is daraisa? I'm sorry, say that once more. Where do we know that aninos is aninos lailas draban? Rabbi Shimon disanya aninos laim divrei Torah de Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds that the aninos, right, the aninos of the night following the day of death is actually daraisa. Rabbi Shimon says no. Rabbi Shimon omer onein eno midivrei Torah ela midivrei sofrim. Rabbi Shimon says not true. Rabbi Shimon says the concept of nighttime aninos, meaning the night following death, is only derabanan. How do we know this? Because again, an onin is able to go to the mikvah. He eats his karban pesach that evening, but he doesn't eat other kachim. So the Gemara says, now is that true? That Rabbi Shimon actually holds that nighttime aninos. So again, remember, when we speak about aninos laila, that refers to aninos the night following the day of death. Is that true? Rabbi Shimon holds that it's the Rabbanan. We learn Rabbi Shimon says, Onain eno mishalech karbanos. An onain cannot send his karbanos to the Beis Hamikdash. My love abafilu b'Pesach. Doesn't that include even karban Pesach? Lo lebarmi Pesach. No, it means everything except Pesach. I'vat hayim b'shimon over shlomim kishu shalim maybe ve'eno maybe kishu onain. But the Gemara Darshan is very interesting. The Gemara a little bit of a play on words over here. Gemara sees how karban shlomim. When do you bring a karban shlomim? When you're shalim. When you're shalim, when you're complete, what does that come to exclude? The Gemara says, ve'eno maybe kishu onain. Ultimately, again, he does not bring it when he is an onain, which I must say, by the way, I just want to point out, is such a fascinating window into the profundity of loss. What happens when a person loses a loved one? What happens? They're not shalim. That's why loss, it's such a fascinating idea. That's why loss is not simply adversity, but loss is literally, again, like a person loses a bit of themselves. This is whenever you lose a loved one, there's a piece of, I've lost a piece of myself. So the Gemara says, I'm not shalim. I'm not sure. It's incredible. How do I know that ultimately, again, it's also I can't bring a toda, that I only can bring a toda? Because a toda is like a shlamim in that, again, it must be eaten b'simcha, in a state of simcha, like shlamim. How do I know to include ola in this also? Ola is like shlamim, because in the same way that shlamim comes ultimately again with a neder or a nedava, so too does an ola. How do I know to include b'char ma'aser pesach? Most of we say include, meaning include it in the prohibition that the onin can't do it. I include b'char ma'aser pesach shekin einon ba'in al chet. Because ultimately, again, these karbanos do not come as sin offerings. Minayin l'rabos chatas v'asham. How do I know to include chatas and asham? Talmud lomar zevach. Good. Minayin l'rabos esa'ofos v'hamanachos v'hayayin v'itzim b'alavona. How do I know to include all of these other sacrifice items? Birds, menachos, wine, even wood offerings. Levona, frankincense. Talmud lomar shlamim karbano. Kol karbanos shu maybe kishu shalim, maybe ve'eno, maybe kishu onin. What Shlomo Rabbi says, all karbanos, mamish all karbanos, you could bring when you are shalim, when you are complete, but you cannot bring them when you are an onin. And Rabbi says, now, amazingly enough, what's included in this list for our purposes? Katani miha Pesach. Pesach is included in this list. So you see from here that you cannot go ahead and bring Karban Pesach in a state of aninos. To which the Gemara says, Rav Chisda, Pesach kedei naske. This is actually a very interesting answer. The Gemara says, yeah, take out Pesach from there. Right? In other words, the Gemara says, you know how it is when you start talking about karbanos, you just get really excited, right? And you just start talking about all karbanos. So Lamaisa, again, so Pesach was kind of just brought up what we call like Kedei Nasve. Kedei Nasve just means in passing, but it's not actually part of the list. So it could very well be that Karban Pesach is actually the exception to this rule, and that's really the rule. Rav Shesha says, my Pesach, what does it mean when it says Pesach? Shalmei Pesach. Perhaps an onain can bring Karban Pesach. The Gemara says ultimately again, but what does Pesach refer to? Shalmei Pesach. Ultimately again, it means the shlamim that come along with Karban Pesach. Ihachi hainu shlamim. If that's the case, then ultimately, again, you should call that shlamim. To which the Gemara says, Tana shlam haba machmas pesach, v'tana shlam haba machmas atzman. The Gemara says, you're right. Rather, we'll say we're teaching two things. We're teaching that an onain can't bring shlamim that come together with Pesach, and also can't bring standalone shlamim. Why I need to teach both? Di'ilo tana shlam haba machmas pesach, because ultimately, again, if you would not have thought shlamim that come as a result of Karban Pesach, I would have thought I would have thought that the same way that a onain can bring shlamim, can bring Pesach, he can also bring shlamim which come as a result of Pesach. Therefore, the Gemara teaches both shlamim that come with Pesach and standalone shlamim that he can't bring either. So I will say, so again, the way the Gemara is kind of standing at this moment right now is that halacha l'maisa, an onain can't bring any karban. Why can't an onain bring any karban? It's actually interesting. It's a drasha. What's the drasha? Shlamim. You can only bring a karban when you are shalim, when you are complete. The exception to this rule is going to be Karban Pesach, right? And the reason for that is why? Because remember, since aninos of the night following the day of death is derabanan, the rabbis suspended their halacha in a situation, ultimately again, of a kares bearing infraction, which would be Karban Pesach if they fail to do it. Okay, good. Rav Mari says, Rav Mari Amar, Bosai top of Kuf, 100. Rav Mari Amar, we're getting by the way, we're nearing the finish line here. Rav Mari, not really. Rav Mari Amar, Lo Kasha, Kansha Meis Lameis Biodalid, the cover of Biyadalid, Kansha Meis Lameis Biod Gimel, the cover of Biyadalid. So I'll say, Rav Mari comes along and reiterates this previous distinction. Perhaps the way that an onain interacts with Karban Pesach is fundamentally dependent on when the death occurred. So look at Rashi just a moment. Lo kasha, Rabbi Shimon, hadik tani hacha onain lo maisi Pesach kishuhu kishameis v'kavro b'yedalid. Listen to this. When do we say that an onain doesn't bring Karban Pesach? That's when death and burial occurred on the 14th. Because we'll say, because in that case, then perhaps he's still in Aninos on the night following the day of primary Aninos. So the Gemara says maybe, in other words, obviously, this opinion is going with the idea that Aninos of the night that follows the day of death is Da'oraisa. If Aninos of the night that follows the day of death is Da'oraisa, then you can't bring Karban Pesach. Masha'enkein, if death occurred on the 13th, burial occurred on the 14th, everyone will agree that there is no aninos on the night following the day of burial. right? When it's not the same day as death. Let me say this a little bit more succinctly. What the Gemara now is suggesting, what Bari is suggesting is, right, that Aninos Mid'oraisa has two parts: the day of death itself and the night following the day of death. That is true whether burial occurred on the day of death or not. However, everyone is agreeing that on the day of burial, no Aninos extend into the night following the day of burial. Therefore, the Gemara suggests like this: if Reuven's father dies on the 13th, right, on the 13th of Nisan, right, so and the burial is on the 14th, everyone agrees that comes the night of the 15th, which is the night of Pesach, he can eat Karan Pesach. He's good to go. Masha'en Kain, if death occurs on the 14th Erev Pesach, even if burial occurs that day, that night, i.e. the 15th, is still Aninos D'Oraisa. And because that's Aninos D'Oraisa, therefore, Aloch L'Maisa, he can't go ahead and eat Karban Pesach. The Gemara says as follows. So the Gemara is not going to go through it. Meisla Meis B'Yodal will say I'm on 100a Kuf Amud Aleph, third line down. Meisla Meis B'Yodal the cover B'Yodalin. So if Yaakov, remember again we've got Reuven his son, Yaakov the father. If Yaakov died on the 14th Erev Pesach and he was buried on the 14th, Yom Misa Tofes Leilo Midaraisa. The day of death always goes ahead and brings with it the following night as part of Aninos. That's the way that it works. Meislo Meis B'Yud Gimel, if on the other hand, Yaakov died on the 13th of Nisan, the cover will be Yudalid, and then he was buried on Yudalid, Kvura Midrabanan, Eino Tofes Leilo Ela Midrabanan. This is very interesting. So remember, the day of burial is also considered to be a day of Aninos. It does bring along with it the following night as well, but only Midrabanan. And therefore, again, perhaps you won't be able to eat Karbanos, but Lamais you'll be able to do Karban Pesach. Incredible. Amrli Rav Ashi Rav Mari, ve'ela hadiktani Amr Rabbi Shimon Teda, Shay Amru Onein Tova va'ochel es Pischo, aval lo bekachim. But one second, what about the following idea? So the Gemara says, what about that Rabbi Shimon said? No, that found that an Onein could go to the mikvah and eat his Karban Pesach, but cannot eat other kachim. Neimale, so why doesn't he say Neimale? Ka'ibna lecha ana yom misa d'oraisa. Va'amritli yom kavura d'rabanan. So why doesn't he answer? I don't understand. I'm talking about the yom misa, which is d'oraisa. Why? Remember again, when we say yom misa d'oraisa, that halacha l'maisa, the yom misa carries with it the following of midoraisa, whereas the yom kavura ultimately again will only carry with it the following evening midrabanan. Why not go ahead and mention that? Gemara says kasha. Okay, question. Abaye says lo kasha. Also no contradiction. They're all just trying to resolve the contradiction. Kan shemes kodem chatzos, kan shemes la'achar chatzos. Okay. So I just want to point out, right, the overarching issue that we still do not have clarity on is this concept of aninos. How long does it apply for? The one thing that everyone agrees with, it sounds like everybody agrees with, is that on the day of death, aninos is da'oraisa. That seems what everybody agrees with. What's a little bit unclear? Does aninos extend into the night following the day of death? If so, is it the oraisa or the rabbanon? And if burial takes place the next day, does aninos status extend into that day of burial? And furthermore, does aninos status extend into the following night after burial? Those are our open-ended questions. Okay, now both say now Abai is going to come along, and this is fascinating. So Abai said, look, it's not a contradiction. Get ready for this. Kan shemes kodem chatzos, kan shemes la'achar chatzos. Ooh, watch this. The Abai wants to suggest that the Onin's ability to consume Karban Pesach on the night of Pesach all depends on when death occurred. If Reuven lost his father, right? If Yaakov died before Chatzos versus Yaakov died after Chatzos, what's the situation? Well, remember again, when does the obligation for Karban Pesach begin? When does it begin? After Chatzos. So watch this. If Yaakov died before Chatzos, that means before this month for Karban Pesach, Reuven was in Aninos. The din of Aninos precludes him from participating in Karban Pesach. Whereas if the death occurred after Chatzos, already again by Chatzos, the obligation for Karban Pesach devolved upon Reuven. If that's the case, then Aninos will not set aside that obligation. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. The Gemara says, 1 second. Kodim Chatzos to lo ichsi Pesach. before Chatzos, where it was not yet this man for Karban Pesach, Chayli Ale Aninos, then Aninos could devolve upon Ruvain. Achar Chatzos, the Pesach lo Chayli Ale Aninos. But after Chatzos already, where there is the obligation ultimately again of Karban Pesach, so Aninos will not devolve on Ruvain. So fascinating. So fascinating. So we'll say, so essentially what it's saying is like this, is in other words, before Chatzos, the status of Aninos is a primary status. And therefore, again, he becomes an onain that precludes him from eating Karban Pesach that night. After Chatzos, the obligation of a Karban Pesach has already devolved upon him. That obligation prevents the halachic status of Aninos from devolving upon him, and therefore he's able to eat Karban Pesach that night. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, hold up. How do you know to make that distinction between before Chatzos and after Chatzos? The Sanya both say this is an incredible Gemara. This is an incredible Gemara. The Sanya, we learned in the Brisa. Get ready for this, both say. La yitama. Okay, so we'll say, so we're going to have a couple of different psukim over here. This is talking about by a Kohen. Stama Kohen, right? No such thing as Stama Kohen, right? Every Kohen is incredible, right? The Gemara is like this. So the pasuk is ulachasa b'sulak rava elava shaloi haisali ish la yitama. Talking about who a Kohen is obligated to become tamei for. So one of the people that a Kohen is obligated to become tamei for is for his sister. It's for his sister, his unmarried sister. So the Gemara says la yitama mitzvah. So we'll say it's interesting. The Torah says la yitama means he shall become tamei for her. To which the Gemara understands it's obligatory. It's obligatory. Now what does this mean? Lo ratza, meaning what? This is incredible. Lo ratza. Let's say the Kohen says, you know what? I love my sister, but I love Hashem more. I want to do the avoda. I want to do the avoda in the base of Mikdash. I don't want to become tamei. I don't want to become tamei. So therefore again he decides an idea. I just want to become tamei. What do? Mitamin also bal karcho. We force him to become tamei. We say these are obligations to your family. We force him to become tamei. So Gemara says, Maisa bi Yosef HaKohen shemese ishto be'erev Pesach. Listen to this. There was a story of Yosef HaKohen, and his wife unfortunately passed away on erev Pesach. V'lo ratza litamei. He did not want to become tamei for her. Now, both say, like, before you rush to any conclusions about like dysfunctionality or anything like that, first of all, you don't know the story, right? Who knows? Who knows what the backdrop? I'm sorry? That was Menachem Shofar. Right, correct. It's like, finally. So again, so what, my point just is, right, with these kind of stories, is this, look, there's no question, definitely sounds a little bit strange, but again, who knows what so I'll say, there's a tremendous Musar Haskell that in general, even when stories sound strange, who knows what the backstory is? Okay, we don't know what the backstory is. Point over here is, he did not want to become tamei. Because if he became tamei at the Levaya, then what was going to happen? No Karban Pesach. See, he just, whatever the cheshbon was, he didn't want to become tamei. Lo ratzli tamei. Listen to this. And ultimately, again, his fellow Kohanim, like literally, Venimdu means like they gathered together, like they put it to a vote, and they were metamei him. Now, what does it mean? In other words, they forced them to go to the Levaya and ultimately, again, become tamei. I will say, just point out how incredible this is. Well, actually, let's finish up a little bit. The Gemara says, well, I'll just mention it now. Let's say, you see from your tremendous Musar Haskell, that at the end of the day, your obligations to your family come before anything and everything else. That even the Ribono Shel Olam himself says, I love you, I appreciate you, and I see how committed you are to me. You have a mishpacha. Those are the people in this world who rely on you more than anything. And those are the people to whom you must exhibit your primary responsibility. To the point that Chodesh Baruch Hu says, I'm actually okay if you put your obligations towards me on the side in order to go ahead and care for your family. Not only is that okay, but ultimately, again, that's what I demand of you. Such a tremendous musar. Because at the end of the day, our family, our loved ones, really have no one but us. The Ribono Shel Olam has all of humanity. So where there is a tension between taking care of my loved ones and ultimately attending to my needs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Ribono Shel Olam gives me the license to be there for my mishpacha. It's incredible. Or many, the Gemara says, they raise a kasha, ula achoso. The pasuk says to his sister. Now again, This is talking about over here a nazir. Now remember the pasuk over here. Now remember a nazir also has restrictions. Interestingly enough, a nazir's tumah status resembles a kohen gadol, not a regular kohen, right? Because a nazir really doesn't become tummy for anyone, even for close relatives. So the pasuk says, la'aviv u'li'imo la'achiv u'la'choso lo yitama lahem. So by a nazir, literally again, he does not become tummy for anyone. Matam. So we'll say. So what is now? What's interesting is the pasuk goes out of to say by nazir to enumerate all of the different relatives. Why do you have to say all the relatives? Matam lomar hare shahalach lishchot es pischov v'lam. Let's listen to this. A person was going to shech his karban pesach or to give a bris milah to his son. And he heard that one of his relatives passed away. Yachol Yitama. Ultimately, again, you would have thought that maybe he should become Tameh. Amrit Lo Yitama. Therefore, the pasuk says, don't become Tameh. Yachol Kishim Shlo Yitama Lachos Okachim Yitama Lemeis Mitzvah. So I assume you might have thought that Allah Chalamais in the same way that let's say the Nazir does not become Tameh for one of these individuals, he also doesn't become Tameh for a Meis Mitzvah. Tamal Amar Lachoso. Therefore, the pasuk says for his sister, he does not become tameh for a relative, but he does become tameh ultimately again for a meis mitzvah. Now, remember again, definition of a meis mitzvah is someone who has no one else to bury them. Now, I do want to point out, let's say the Nazir's sister died and there's no one else to bury her. Obviously, she then becomes a meis mitzvah. The Gemara just uses the example of a relative because the Gemara presupposes that if the Nazir doesn't do it, there's someone else to do it. But obviously, if there's no one else to do it, then that relative obviously becomes a meis mitzvah. Lav shmamina. So we'll say, how do you understand this distinction? Kan kodim chatzos, kan la'achar chatzos. It must be about that this distinction ultimately, again, regarding karban pesach, must be that everything is dependent on when the loss occurred. If the death occurred before chatzos, then the obligation for aninos devolves upon him, ultimately again before the obligation for Pesach. That precludes him from doing karban Pesach. Masha'inkin, if the death occurred after chatzos, the obligation for karban Pesach precedes aninos, and therefore that evening he'll eat karban Pesach. To which the Gemara says, how do you know that? Mimai, maybe both cases are talking about after chatzos. Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Akiva, and it's two different opinions. All the two the Sanya, Lo Yitama, this is fascinating. Lo Yitama. So remember again, once again by Nazir. Pasuk says Lo Yitama. So the Gemara says Rishus to Rabbi Shmuel. Ultimately, again, this is a Rishus. This is a Rishus. These are the words of Rabbi Shmuel. In other words, it's optional. Rabbi Kiva says Chova. No, it's obligatory. Sumar says Sagdait Federation that he Rabbi Akiva Katani law. So I'll say, so I would have thought like this. The Gemara says, I would have thought that since the beginning of the Bryce says Rabbi Akiva, the beginning of the Mishnah is Rabbi Akiva, the beginning of the Bryce is Rabbi Akiva, the Sanya. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Nefesh Elu HaKrovim. So ultimately, again, when it says Nefesh, this is talking about, again, Kol Yemei Hiziro LaHashem. All the days that he is in Nazir, Al Nefesh Meis Lo Yavo. For any deceased person, he shall not expose, he shall not expose himself to Tumah. So the Gemara says, Nefesh Elu HaKrovim. That refers even to relatives. Meis elu harachokim. That refers even to people who are not related. La'aviv elu matame. So it says again, to his father he does not become tameh. Matame hu lemeis mitzvah. But he does become tameh for a meis mitzvah. We'll say first white line at the bottom. Li'imo. What does it mean for his mother? And I will say. So what the Gemara is saying is like this. Here's the problem with the psukim. On one hand, the pasuk says, Kol yimei hiziro la'Hashem al nefesh meis lo yavo. All the days that the Nazir is a Nazir, he should not become Tameh, right? He does not come in contact with a corpse. Now, both say, that pasuk is the catch-all. Then the next pasuk goes on and says, La'aviv u'le'imo, la'achiv u'la'achoso, la'yitama. Then it says, again, for his father, for his mother, for his brother, for his sister, he should not become Tameh. It's repetitive. So now the Gemara darshans, why do you need those specifically enumerated individuals? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. La'aviv teaches me he doesn't become tamei for his father, but he does become tamei for a meis mitzvah. Li'imo, what does imo teach me? Haya kohen v'hu nazir. Listen to this. Let's say he was both a kohen and a nazir. Li'imo hu de'inu b'tamei v'tamei meis mitzvah. He doesn't become tamei for his mother, but he does become tamei for a meis mitzvah. Okay, la'achiv, what does la'achiv teach me? Shimhaya Kohen Gadol v'hu Nazir. Again, I will say they're just talking about additional elevated cases of Kiddusha. If he was a Kohen Gadol and a Nazir, he doesn't become Tamei for his brother, but he does become Tamei for a Meis Mitzvah. So what's la'achoso? Matam, what is it coming to teach me? Hari shahalach lishchot es pischo. Let's say he's on his way to Shech his current Pesach. He's on his way to circumcise his son. V'shama shemeis lameis, and he heard that a relative died. Yachol yitama. You might have thought that he should become tamei. Amrit lo yitama. Therefore, the pasuk says no, he does not become tamei. Yachol kishim she'in mitamei lachoso. Kachim mitamei lemeis mitzvah. You might have thought that in the same way he doesn't become tamei for his sister, he also doesn't become tamei for a meis mitzvah. Tamei lomar ula'achoso. Therefore, the pasuk is la'achoso. La'achoso lo yitama avayitame hu lemeis mitzvah. He does not become tamei ultimately again for his sister, but he does become tamei for a meis mitzvah. Incredible. We'll say on base. Rava says, "Idi v'idi achar chatzos." It's possible that both cases ultimately are talking about after chatzos. Listen to this. Below kashya. Kan kodem sheshachto. Listen to this. Kan kodem sheshachto v'zarko alav. Kan la'achar sheshachto v'zarko alav. Oh, we'll say, watch this. So the Gemara wanted to suggest before that maybe the whole relationship of the onin with Karban Pesach is fundamentally dependent on what? When did the death occur? If the death occurred before Chatzos, therefore what? Aninos came before the obligation of Karban Pesach, and therefore the onin is precluded from eating Karban Pesach. But if the death occurred after Chatzos, then the obligation ultimately again for Karban Pesach preceded Aninos, and therefore eating Karban Pesach that night. Comes along Rabbi says, no, that's not the distinction. What's the distinction? Did they already do Shchita and Zrika? And I also remember again, the way, how does it work for Karban Pesach? Halavai Miras Hashem. In Miras Hashem, we're going to find out this year. How does it work for Karban Pesach? Before the Karban is shechted, you have to be part of a Chabura, right? You have to be part of a group. Remember, so Karban Pesach is shechted on Erev Pesach afternoon, sometime after Chatzos. In order to partake on Karban Pesach, on the night of Pesach, you must be part of a Chabura already before it. So listen to this. Gemara says, maybe, kan kodim sheshachtu v'zarko alav, kan la'achar shatus. We'll say, listen to this. Perhaps the distinction is like this. When did the death occur? If the death occurred before Shechita and Zrika of the Karban, then Aninos preceded your official membership in a Chabura, and therefore you can't eat that night. Whereas if first they shechted and did Zrika, and then the death occurred, you're already vested as part of a Chabura. If you're already vested as part of a Chabura, then you could go ahead and eat Karban Pesach that night. So fascinating. So the Gemara says as follows. Good. And I will say, in this case, by the way, according to this approach, it makes no difference whether the death was before or after Chatzos, right? Even if death was after Chatzos, if they didn't do Shechita and Zrika yet, if you're Karban Pesach, Aninos precludes you from eating that night, right? But if already Shechita and Zrika occurred, you're vested, and if death occurs afterwards, you could go ahead and eat that night. Fascinating. Achar sheshachtu v'zarko es damo. What's ready this? My dahava hava. Oh, best phrase of all of Shas. Right? So says, 1 second, I don't understand. If halacha l'maisa, if they already did Shechita and Zrika, the Gemara says, I'll say, watch this. My dahava hava means essentially, who cares about what happens afterwards? In other words, what's done is done. Now, what does this mean? People say, this is riveting. Take a look at Rashi. My dahava hava. It's the second short line in Rashi. My dahava hava. Hari niftar va'amai dachi achilaso aninos laila d'rabanan tfei mishar kachim. Now, we'll say, get ready for this. The Gemara suggests, we'll say, Karbanos 101. What's the ikar of any carbon? Ikar of any carbon? Good. Okay. Expected to hear more than one person with that, but okay, that's good, right? Let's say so. Let me say again, right? Zrika is the ikar. So therefore, the Gemara we have a confirmation, right? So the Gemara says Zrika is the ikar. So remember again, both sides. But here's what the Gemara suggests. That's true by Karban Pesach as well, and therefore the Gemara wants to suggest like this: once Zrika was done, right? Once Zrika was done, essentially, who cares about eating the carbon that night? That doesn't matter. In other words, why don't we just say like this? Once Zrika was done before Aninos, right? So let's say again, right? So it's Erev Pesach, Ruvain is fine. So he's part of a Chabura. They do Zrika. After Zrika, now Yaakov, Ruvain's father, dies. So when I'm suggesting, now Reuben is allowed to eat Karban Pesach that night. The Gemara says, why? Just say no, you can't eat Karban Pesach. You can't eat Karban Pesach because of Aninos. But here's the good news. You're good anyway. Why you could anyway? Because again, halacha l'maisa, you were part of a Chabura during Zrika. And since you're part of a Chabura during Zrika, you're good to go. You're good to go. Which I will say is fascinating because never did we think to apply the Zrika metric to Karban Pesach. Because we always focus on Karban Pesach. For our purposes, what's the ikar of Karban Pesach? Or at least we always say, what's the ikar? What's the ikar? Eating. Eating. Constantly, Gemara says, no. Karban Pesach is just like any other Karban. And as long as you are part of the Chabura at the time of Zrika, you're golden. You could actually have both. In other words, say, no, you can't eat it that night because of Aninos. But it doesn't matter because you are part of a Chabura ultimately, again, by Zrika. Gemara says, here's the problem. No, because the Gemara says you do need, you're right. Even though by Stam Karbanos, Zrika is the Iker, by Karban Pesach, you do need consumption. You have to eat it. The Gemara says, so the Gemara says, based on what Rabbi Shmuel says, listen to what your Rebbe is saying to you. What does Rabbi Shmuel say? This is very interesting. Yom Shmua, really interesting. So now we're going to get into a little bit of the halachas of Avelos. Yom Shmua, ki Yom Kavura l'mitzas Shiva u'shloshim. Okay, so you're supposed to listen to this. Yom Shmua, the day that you hear, this is what we call a Shmua Krova. Shmua Krova means that let's say a person was not present at the death of a loved one, but they heard about the death within 30 days of it. We'll say, see, we can't wrap our head around these concepts because, Baruch Hashem, we live like in an age of instant communication. But just know that for a very long time, it was quite possible that a person would lose a loved one and they would not hear about it until sometime later on. So there's what's called in halacha Shmua Krova. Shmua Krova literally means I heard about the death of a loved one. When I say loved one, someone who I'm obligated to sit shiva for within 30 days of the loss. If that's the case, then the day that you hear is Kiyom Kvura, the mitzvah Shiva Shloshim. So if you hear within 30 days, you have to sit shiva and observe Shloshim just like it was the actual day of the death. Ulachilas psachim Kiyom Likot Atzamos. But I will say in terms of eating Karban Pesach, the day that you hear about the death, even if it's within 30 days, is treated like the day, ultimately, again, that you gathered the bones. Okay, so we'll say, now what does this mean? So the halacha is like this. Likot Atzamos means the day that, let's say, we'll say, just to give you an insight, we actually had this in Moed Katan a little bit. Common burial practice was like this. What people would do is, they would go ahead and they would essentially bury people like in caves. They had like holiday areas in the caves. You place the body like in a shelf in a cave, the body would decompose. After the body decomposed, you would then take the bones, and bones would often be interred in a family plot. So I'll say, the day that you gather the bones, that's called Likot Atzamos. There's a quasi-avelos on that day. But again, it's only limited to that day. That night, you could already eat kachim. Someone says, watch this. So let's say again, Reuven lost his father. Reuven was not there at the day of death. Reuven hears that Yaakov, his father, died. He hears about it within 30 days. The day that he hears about it, that triggers an obligation of Shiva and Shloshim. However, for Karban Pesach purposes, he would be permitted to eat Karban Pesach that night. Because the day that you hear is the day that you collect the bones, where there's only a limited amount of Avelos on that day. And in either case, you go to the mikveh, you can eat karbanos that night. Mostly here's the problem, it's an inherent contradiction. Hagufa kasha. You just contradicted yourself. Amrit, on one hand you said, Yom Shmua Kiyom Kavur Lemitzas Shivo Shloshim. You just said that when you hear about the death, within 30 days of the death, the day that you hear is like the day of death, and you have to observe Shiva and Shloshim. And then you said, Ulachilas Psachim Kiyom Likot Atzamos. Then you just said that for Karban Pesach purposes, the day that you hear about the death, even if it's within 30 days, is not like the day of death itself, but rather it's like the day that you collect the bones, which is a much more limited form of Avelos. Michlal, we'll say first wide line, Michlal, the Yom Kivura fil erev nami lo ochel. Now what I can infer from that is that on an actual day of death and burial, you would not be able to eat Karban Pesach that night. V'hadar tani, and then you said, Echad zeh v'echad zeh, tova v'ochel b'kachim l'erev. And then you said afterwards, in either case, you can go to the mikvah and eat kachim that night. So which one is it? Which one is it? Can you eat kachim on the night following death or not? It's machlokes tanaim. Incredible. The Gemara says, Rabbi Ravuna Amar Lo Kasha. Kan sheshama is very interesting. Kan sheshama shmua al meso samach l'shkias achama. One case is talking about again where you heard about the death right before Shkia, or you collected the bones right before Shkia, or again, literally death occurred and burial occurred right before Shkia, and ultimately again, one is talking about a case of after Shkia Sachama. And I will say, now what does this mean? Take a quick look in Rashi. In Rashi, it's the wide lines, 4 lines into the wide lines. Just take a look at the first line of Rashi. Dahabile Erev Leil Yom Kvura, the Leil Yom Shmua, the Leil Psachim B'Yom Likot Atzamos, the Savi Yom Kvura, Lo Tafis Leilo Afila Midrabanon. The Choshkin Yom Shmua, the Likot Ba'atzamos. V'Haditani Reisha Achila Psachim Kyom Likot Atzamos Ilu Yom Kvur. So I was just like this. Really, maybe the distinction is as follows. If all of these events occurred before Shkia, so Aninos, right, the din Aninos only applies that day. This opinion holds that Aninos does not draw in the following night. Versus, ultimately, again, Halach L'maisa, if it occurred after Shkia, then obviously, again, the person will be precluded from Karban Pesach and all other Karbanos. I understand. If it happened after Shkia, what is there to discuss? Rather, Rabosai. So again, the Gemara says, I don't understand. If it's after Shkia Sachama, then that means what? You already shechted Karban Pesach. If you already shechted Karban Pesach, Maida Hava Hava. Rather, Rabosai, what do you see from here? Coming full circle, what do you see from here? That Pesach is not like other Karbanos. In what sense? That whereas by other Karbanos, what's the Iker? What's the Iker? Zrika. By Karban Pesach, yes, Zrika is definitely the Iker. However, you also need consumption. You also need consumption. That it is not enough just to be part of a chabura, ultimately again for zrika, but you must also be able to actually eat and partake of the carbon. Incredible, incredible. Ravashi said. So we'll say, so that happens just to be an interesting fact by Karban Pesach. That does not necessarily give us clarity with the rest of our whole Aninos discussion over. Ravashi says, "My echad zeh v'echad zeh." What does it mean to say? Echad Yom Shmua ve'echad Yom Likut, both on a day. Yom Shmua means you hear about that, the day that you hear about the death of your loved one. We're assuming over here that this is occurring within 30 days. So both the day of Shmua as well as the day that you collect the remains of your loved one. What's talacha? Tova va'ocha b'kachim la'erev. In both of those cases, you go to the mikvah, and ultimately, again, you can eat kachim at night. I v'had Rav Ashi, but the statement of Rav Ashi, bedusehi, ultimately is a mistake. Michti Allah koi zeh v'zeh miboyle. Why does it say Allah? It should say zeh v'zeh. Allah shmamina bedusehi. Rather, again, we'll say, what do you see from here? The Rav Ashi statement ultimately, again, is a mistake. Umay tanoi, and I will say, what is this machlokes? So I'll say, here we're going to get into it. Now we're approaching the finish line of this sugya. What is this machlokes? Here we go. This I will say. So now remember all of this this entire sugya. Really, well, now we went on a little bit of a Karban Pesach detour, but this entire sugya really is rooted in this concept of aninos, daraisa, derabanan, and how long does it extend for? So here we go. Admasai misonin alav. How long does aninos extend for? To which the Gemara says, Kol hayom, the whole day. Now what that means is like this. Let's say, right, Yaakov, Reuven's father, Yaakov dies on Tuesday. So how long does Aninos extend for? All of Tuesday. Tuesday he's in Aninos. Rabbi says, no, Kol Zman Shelo Nikbar. Ooh, right. So he comes along and says, no, the status of Aninos starts at the time of death and goes all the way until the time of burial. Okay, so what are we dealing with over here? Ilema biyom misa as well. So again, so now here's the interesting case over here. When we say until he was buried, okay, the obvious question that's going to come up is when is burial taking place? So Ilema biyom misa. So ultimately, you're going to say if haloch lamaisa, we're talking about yom misa, right, the day of death. In other words, and burial taking place the day of death. Mi ika de lesle di yom misa de tafes leila midrabanan. Does anyone disagree that Aninos, that on the day of death, that Aninos goes into the following night midrabanan? In other words, we'll say, I thought everyone agrees with that concept. V'su Rebbe Omer Kol Zman Shelo Nikbar. Now, Rebbe says Aninos goes. So there's two questions over here, right? So Rebbe says that Aninos extends up until the time of burial. So we'll say, what about the following case? Now watch this. Let's say Yaakov dies on Tuesday. So we'll say, so remember, so the first opinion said, Tanakama said, Aninos extends the whole day. Rebbe says until Kvura. Let's say Yaakov died on Tuesday at 8 a.m. And then what happens? The Levaya was 1 p.m. 1 p.m. And then they finished the Levaya, it's 2 p.m. So what? Is Aninos over? Is Aninos over? That means there's no more Aninos. Everyone agrees that the Aninos status extends the entire day. Now this is actually pretty wild, because what the Gemara is suggesting over here is that perhaps, get ready for this, perhaps Aninos even extends past when? Past burial. Because maybe Aninos is the status the entire day of death. And even if burial took place on that day, you would still be an onen after burial. That's what the Gemara is suggesting here. So the Gemara quotes the pasuk of V'acharisa ki yom amar. And afterwards, in other words, the Gemara is interpreting this pasuk metaphorically. All right? And it's acharisa, and its aftermath is bitter. Its aftermath is bitter, which the Gemara understands to mean the entire day of death is bitter, meaning the entire day of death is aninos. Rav Sheshes ayom kvura kai. That's actually referring to the day of burial itself. And there's both sides. So halacha l'maisa, the real machlokes is, does aninos only extend up until the burial, or ultimately again will aninos? So both say, you understand like the test case over here. The test case is, there's really two test cases. Number one, if burial does not occur on the same day of death, does aninos extend past the day of death onto the day of burial? And number two is, if burial does occur on the same day of death, does aninos extend past burial? That's the shaila. So Maskav Yosef Alahadik Tani, that which we learned, Hashameya al Meso, if one hears about the death of his loved one, and again within 30 days, he says, Kimalakit atzamos, it's the same thing as if he went ahead and collected the remains. Tova va'ochel b'kadshim la'erev. Ultimately, again, he goes to the mikvah, and he goes ahead and he eats kachim in the evening. Mechlau, the yom kvura, afilu la'erev nami lo'achol, which also makes it sound like that if it's the day of the kvura, right, if it's the day of the actual kvura, even that night, he will not eat karbanos. So the Gemara says, how many? Whose opinion does that reflect? Elataritz, rather the way to say it is as follows. Elataritz, ad masai misonin alav, until when does the status of aninos devolve upon an individual? Kol osa hayom v'leilo. Also get ready for this. How long does the period of aninos extend? The entire day, and the following night. Rabbi says, Kozman Shalom Nikbar, as long as the person has not been buried. Aval Nikbar, below Leilo. So we'll say, but again, once burial has occurred, then the following night is not in Aninos. Amrua Kamid Rabbi Yirmiyah. So Rabbi Yirmiyah said, they said this before Rabbi Yirmiyah, Amar, Gavra Rabak, Rav Yosef, Lema Hachi. Will a great Malek Rav Yosef actually say this? Lema, the Rebbe, Lukula. The Rebbe's going to turn out that Rebbe's going to be the more megal opinion. That Tanya, but we learn ad masai misonin alav. Until what point in time does aninus develop upon an individual calls manshen or nikbar? As long as burial has not taken place. Avilu mikan va'ad asara yomim divrei Rebbe. Wow, that's pretty dramatic. So Rebbe actually holds, Rabbi saying, that the status of aninus begins at the time of death and literally again goes all the way until the actual time of Kvura. Obviously, this is a hyperbolic statement. Even if Kvura were not to happen for 10 days later, halacha l'maaseh, it'd be in the status of aninus the entire time. Shmuel says a pretty dramatic statement. The Chacham say no, ein misonin alav ela osa hayom bilvad. Ultimately, again, you're only an onain when? The actual day of death. Right? So this is actually very interesting because according to the Chachamim, it sounds like what would happen is if for some reason burial was delayed, you're on aninus the day of death, and that's it. And that's it. Afterwards, there's no aninus. Ela taritzachi. Rather, again, I will say interpret it as follows: Ad masai hu misonin alav kol osa hayom below leilo. Ultimately, again, I will say, when does aninus extend to? Through the day of burial. This is assuming that burial is happening within some proximity to death. But again, aninus does not extend into the night following burial. Aninus will extend into the night following death, but not the night following burial. Rebbe says, Kozman shelo nikbar. Rebbe says, no. Aninus extends until burial occurs. The nikbar tofes leilo. Not only that, but aninus will extend into the night following burial. So Rebbe say, so a tremendous machlokes over here. According to Rebbe, according to the Chachamim, so aninus will extend ultimately again through the day of death, and that's it. And that's it. Takes the following night with it, but not the night after burial. According to Rebbe, aninus extends ultimately again aninus will extend up until burial. Not only that, but it even extends into the night following burial. All right, so we'll stop over here for today. Again, we get a little bit of a cliffhanger. We're going to get we just have a couple of more lines to the resolution also. But by the way, excellent job today. Shkoyach. Incredible. So we left off 5 lines up from the bottom. We'll finish the Sugi Meretz Hashem tomorrow, both saying Shkoyach. So again, tomorrow we'll get to Halacha L'Maisa, both really for Aninus. Our Aninus Halacha L'Maisa contemporary practice, Aninus L'Gabi Karbanos, Meretz Hashem tomorrow, Shkoyach. Is this still too loud? It's not too loud, it's good. Giving me a headache, but I don't know. It's giving me a headache, but I don't know if it's just me. It could just be me. All right, have a great day, everyone.